Hello, my name is Osha. I talk about American presidents, and I'm continuing with my discussion on the false narratives about our presidents and, some of American history. Now, I want to try and keep these short, but I hadn't finished my discussion, my narrative, in the earlier video I did. Uh, there was something that I came across regarding um, President Lyndon B. Johnson. And Lyndon B. Johnson, of course, did a lot for civil rights, and the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination, especially against minorities, marginalized communities, including Black people. Did a lot for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Immigration and Nationality Act, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. He did a ton for the Great Society programs and the anti-poverty programs. Now, and I've often come to wonder why it is that he gets demonized and villainized a lot. He gets villainized, of course, because of his escalation of the Vietnam War. He didn't start the Vietnam War, to be sure, but he did escalate it. And I try and read extensively on American presidents, so I'm not one-sided. And I remember I came across a narrative claiming that Lyndon B. Johnson's wife was that the reason that Lyndon Johnson continued and escalated the Vietnam War was because his wife was benefiting directly financially from America's involvement, because she had a company that made ammunition and weapons, that were used in Vietnam. That has never been proven, so that's one of the false narratives. I heard narratives about him being involved with gangsters who killed on his behalf, and him having even been involved with the assassination of JFK. All of those are amongst the false narratives that I think should be debunked. They're false narratives, and I've wondered, how did you know the false narratives demonizing Lyndon B. Johnson, who apparently did uh, about as much for Black Americans as any uh, U.S. president, apart from Abraham Lincoln. How did these start? And I've wondered if it's because of his support and his successful passage of legislation ending Jim Crow and advancing the civil rights of Black Americans. I've wondered if American presidents, those presidents who've supported civil rights for blacks, advanced them, they've often been demonized, including apparently Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, was one of our presidents who apparently was our 23rd president, and he was passionate about advancing civil rights for Black people, right? In supporting education for Black people, but he's often categorized as one of our worst presidents. Now, to be fair, he is called the billion-dollar president because he increased spending by our spending, the federal spending grew to $1 billion under him. So maybe that's why he's called he's categorized as one of the worst presidents. And he did get defeated by Grover Cleveland, uh, who he'd initially defeated to obtain the presidency, right? And in terms of Lyndon Johnson, to be fair, there was something that he did, because they normally project Lyndon Johnson as two-faced, right? As being like a snake in the green grass kind of character. Well, there are some things that he was notorious for. The Lyndon, the Johnson treatment, like he browbeated, he would browbeat people to get his way in Congress. It was known to scream, to shake people up, and things like that. And there was something that I found, questionable in reading his biography, and it was there. He had been a congressman by the time Second World War started, and so he joined the Navy, and he was sent on a fact-finding mission, right? And across the Pacific, he never saw military action, and apparently their plane was ostensibly shot at, but members of the crew, who got off, later on, their narrative was very different. Their narrative was that, well, they just had a mechanical fault, right? A mechanical fault, and they had to stop or something like that. But there was another narrative on behalf of Lyndon Johnson, that they escaped, that they evaded enemy fire, during this fact finding mission, in which LBJ had been a representative on behalf of FDR. Franklin Roosevelt was president at the time during the Second World War. And for that, LBJ became the only president who earned a Silver Star. He won a medal, right? And the rest of the crew did not. And it was pinned on him. He was awarded that medal by Douglas MacArthur, right? The general. MacArthur, they say MacArthur gave him the medal because he was constantly pandering to congressmen and politicians in Washington, D.C., because he had political ambition. So, hey, one does not know. So maybe LBJ earned that suspicion, the notorious image that, people sort of used to smear his image. I don't know. But, you know, Another president that I wanted to clarify, I wanted to talk about is Thomas Jefferson and the early founding fathers who were slave owners, because I'm doing something, and I normally refer to the intellect of U.S. presidents and those who had genius level intellect, and I've often included Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now I'm not going to go deep into James Madison, but the irony of being a slave owner, somebody who owns 600 slaves. That's Thomas Jefferson. He had 600 slaves throughout his lifetime. The irony of calling such a person a genius or a hard worker, a diligent person, a polymath. Uh, Leonardo da Vinci did not have slaves to help him with his inventions and things like that. Yes, Thomas Jefferson, I had called him a horticulturist, right? He had curiosity, right? He did a variety of things. He did got involved in engineering, in architecture, and designing his homes and things like that. But hey, he had 600 slaves at his disposal. If I had 600 slaves, God forbid, was 600 people at my disposal like he did, I'd do far more. So, I thought I should put that disclaimer there, because because when I tout his intelligence, based on what historians say, and these histrometrics that put his IQ up there, maybe it's a little bit it's ironic when we do not put it in balance, in perspective, that, well, he had 600 human beings at his disposal, and his outputs, his works were probably not entirely due to um, his own individual efforts, or his energy or his diligence, right? So he relied on 600 different people that never got credit. So yeah, I thought I should mention that, and and it goes to us in America not never admitting that, we like that false narrative of people who just individuals who are dogged, individualistic, and pull themselves up by the bootstraps and can do without anybody's help. They can their success is just innate, and it's not contingent on the contributions of any other factors, or societal or communal help, and we pretend like we're a nation that's completely hostile. In sentiment and visceral reaction, we are, but in reality, our success is based on the contributions of others, right? Of society, our ancestors, and things like that. Because we act like we detest people who come from money, who had help, and things like that. I thought, while I was reading about Robert Duvall, for instance, we've all been praising Robert Duvall's excellent acting, his talent, his gift, everybody, the accolades, right? And at the same time, I see the irony while Robert Duvall is being praised, right, and there are all these great praises for him, you know, upon his demise. And I saw somebody who actually described him about the great American story, again, of that individual who just comes and makes it out of nothing. And I've gone to read his biography, right? And that it contrasts significantly to another new piece of news that's agog around the world. That's the privileged prince, former Duke of York, Andrew, who was arrested. And it's like the world is excited because this was somebody who had privilege, and Americans like to see those who were born with privilege, who didn't earn it. They like to see them come down. It's ironic that his offenses were actually done in America with Americans, right? And so there's something going on. We're not talking, we're not talking, we're not yet talking, we're not really exposing the truth yet about, this cabal, this cult, or this secret society, or whoever they are, that's engaging in criminal activities against, children, right? And just committing crimes against humanity. And you know, Prince, well, formerly Prince Andrew is now excoriated and he's been arrested. I don't know how far that's gone. And at the same time, I looked at the contrast that, okay, how um, Robert Duvall, of course, he has nothing to do with any of this, there's no association. But I'm talking about with respect to their their lineage, right? You know, how I found out that Robert Duvall, apparently his father was a rear admiral. So he came from privilege. His father, a rear admiral, in the Navy, US Navy is equivalent to that, like that's a major general in the army, right? A rear admiral, those people, generals, we know how our generals, they're not billionaires, they're not, but they're not poor people. We could regard our generals as upper class in America because we've always respected our generals. Our first president was a general. A number of our early presidents were generals. We respected them. We continue to respect generals, right? And they always, generals don't die poor. They're about the people who, well, apart from, unfortunately, the early ones like Ulysses S. Grant, and if he was a former president, but no president is going to drive poor again in America. No American president will, hopefully, right? Because now they have pensions. Same thing as our generals. They have very, lucrative pensions. So Robert Duvall's father was a general, what had been a rear admiral, which is equivalent to a general. But at the same time, I was seeing this interview about how he was struggling, he was poor, he was struggling with Gene Hackman. By the way, he and Gene Hackman have been best friends. They lived together, they went to school together, right? They were classmates and they lived together. So they've been friends for 70 years. And I'd mentioned in an earlier video that it's unfortunate that he died about a year from today. Gene Hackman, he died in his home at 95 years old as well. Of course, Robert Duvall died at 95 just a few days ago. So these it's remarkable. They were blessed to live long lives, and they both, it's remarkable that both of them, former classmates, former best friends, roommates, they lived the same number of years, 95 years, died exactly about 1 year apart from each other. These mysterious things in life. I was reading, and there have been these interviews and discussions, but trying to misrepresent Robert Duvall as having come from an indigent background, and about how he struggled with James Caan. He'd actually been classmates with James Caan, or I think they also lived together at one time. Yeah. So it's interesting that they both played Sonny and Sonny and Tom Hagen in The Godfather, who were best friends. I don't know if anybody knows the story, right? In the story, the original Myra Puzo book, because The Godfather doesn't tell us the movie. We don't, that narrative isn't given to us in the movie. Um, Tom Hagen was an Irish kid. I think he was indigent, sort of homeless, but Sonny found him. He was Sonny's friend, and Sonny found him in the street, and Sonny took him home. And so Tom Hagen was sort of adopted by the Godfather Don Corleone, and he became part of the family. So he had been Sonny's best friend. Sonny met him. He was an Irish kid, who was virtually homeless on the street, and so Sonny took him home, and the Godfather adopted him. So he became a brother to the Corleone kids. That's Tom Hagen. That was the story. So it was interesting finding out that um, Robert Duvall didn't actually come from an indigent background, as the media is sort of projecting, portraying right now. That's a misrepresentation. He actually came from privilege, right? His father had been a rear admiral. Now, if telling the truth that this guy really came from privilege, would it diminish his output, the work he did, his talent, or the impact he made? No. I don't know what this, the spinning of the false narratives of this, like a Cinderella story of America, that, something comes from poverty, and you could just make it up. And maybe that's because we haven't told the truth about our origin story, right? A lot of Americans, again, like I was saying, that there's this misrepresentation, like everybody came from Plymouth, everybody was a pilgrim, all our colonists, the initial people were all like colonists who came, they were the pilgrims, and they came for reasons, religious tolerance and liberty. No, 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 no. And they were fighting tyranny. That wasn't the case, right? That wasn't the case. A lot of people that came in the 17th century to America, 18th, 17th, and 18th century, were actually convicts from Europe, from Great Britain, right? From France in Louisiana. Louisiana was created as a penal colony in 1719. And England, Great Britain had started to use Maryland, Georgia, and some other parts, some other colonies as penal colonies where they sent convicts, right? They were sending convicts from Britain, and undesirables or rejects or whatever, because Britain had a problem with uh, you know public executions, right? So back then, if they would execute people for the most trivial reasons, and so they were concerned about increasing public executions because of the the growth, the explosion in population in the big cities, especially London, and how it could cause a riot, right? It could cause a riot, a revolution. So Britain was very concerned about that. And so instead of executing people, because I think they didn't execute people privately, I guess for legal reasons, they had to make it public, right? That due process had been followed, So instead of doing that, they gave the convicts a chance to come to the Americas and start afresh, get a new life. So remember, there were whites who came initially as indentured servants, and so they would work off their penalty. And when they were released, often many between 4 to 7 years. Now, America never talks about the U.S. having, parts of U.S. having actually started out as penal colonies, but America likes to talk a lot about how Australia was a penal colony. In fact, Australia did not become a penal colony. That's New South Wales. That's what the area that was initially colonized as a penal colony. That didn't become established until America, until Great Britain had lost the 13 colonies due to the Revolutionary War, right? So the penal colony established in New South Wales it wasn't established until about 1788, right? So, so again, just concerns about, the false narratives, if we can be true to our story, because if you tell the truth about yourself, right, um, you know, you can, the steps, the path you take are more concrete, right, and more certain. But sometimes, as an individual, and sometimes you can take what you do as an individual and project it, outside, and You start from a micro, microcosm, right? And then you explode it, you magnify it, right? Like just moving from the sample to a larger population, right? So what I'm saying is, as an individual, I know my style, right? I can't lie to myself, right? I never lie to myself. I have to be truthful with myself in order to accomplish what it is that I want to do. Because I have to be. If you're lying to yourself, you're deluding yourself. You're delusional, right? You're delusional. And if you don't have a grasp on reality, on facts, you cannot make the appropriate plans to achieve your goals, right? Even when people achieve goals that seem larger than life, that seem impossible, they still have a strong grasp of reality, right? It's not because they're quixotic. And I think we've embraced this notion that the more quixotic, the more Panglossian we are. Again, that's from Voltaire's Candide. That's somebody who just didn't have a grasp of reality, right? Like being Pollyannish. You don't have being quixotic, you have this delusional, romantic, idealized notion of things that just have no relationship with facts, with reality. Like the underdog. The underdog doesn't have to be delusional to be able to defeat the Leviathan, the mammoth, or whatever. It's like David does not have to be delusional in order to defeat Goliath because it seems impossible. David had a strategy. You just have to have a good strategy, right? If you have a good strategy and you're factual and you're calm, you're able to defeat Goliath. I think America. We like to identify with that with the underdog, but the thing is, I think we we use the motivation that the underdog can only succeed, can only defeat the the giant if he's delusional, right? Because every what is common sense in reality, doesn't give the underdog a chance. But no, there's solutions. There are a number of variables, and you can always alter the variables, and you need a strong grasp of facts, of reality, and you can always defeat uh, the Goliath, right? Um, so that was something that I thought I should address. Just the spinning of false narratives and how it affects, um, raison d'etre. Again, that's your justification for existing, right? And you know, today many people are not living their best lives in America. Many people are struggling just because there's a false script, there's a false narrative that's being spun, and Americans are being sold a lie, and we allow ourselves to be deceived. It's just like the basics. You need a good education. I think we're an advanced nation. Having a great education is very important. We need to have a good education. But now the cost of education is so atrocious, right? That Americans can't afford it, right? Americans can't afford it, and then we're now instead we're trying to pretend like education doesn't matter. It's not worth it. It's not valuable, right? Um, Besides, some people spinning the false narrative that education is a luxury. Then why did our founding fathers, right? Our founding fathers all valued education. Even George Washington. George Washington he didn't have much formal education beyond elementary education, but he was a qualified surveyor, and he was a soldier. He was a general, right? He was intelligent. He focused on constant improvement. You see John Adams. John Adams went to Harvard. He trained as a lawyer. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. These were all lawyers, right? John Quincy Adams, all lawyers, right? From number 2 to number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7. They're all lawyers. Who was number 8? Number 8 was Martin Van Buren. He was a lawyer, right? Number nine, William Henry Harrison. He had actually been in med school. He had started training in med school, but when his father died, he left med school and went to become a career soldier. So he became a soldier, a general. He became a general, right? He was a war hero, right? He was known as Tippecanoe, his nickname. So these were very educated people. Our founding fathers, even the ones who couldn't afford education, like Millard Fillmore, who never had formal education, he went, looked for books, he trained himself, right? He trained, and this was when America was like, America was like still, it was underdeveloped, right? He trained himself, acquired education, became a lawyer, practiced as a lawyer. That's Millard Fillmore. Same thing as Abraham Lincoln, became a lawyer. So education was very, very important at our founding. We valued it. So today, man, they've made education seem like a luxury just because, again, uh, there are these oligarchs who want to make Americans just a cog in somebody's money making wheel. And that's not what the richest country in the world should be doing for its citizens, right? That's a huge disservice that's going on today. I'm going to stop this video here and I can continue later on. My name is Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.